So I've chosen to live life dangerously in this video by wearing entirely Mazda Team Yost team gear. That means there's an almost certainty of something catching on fire during this video. In fact, in testing for this video, my beard burned off. So that was a terrible, terrible tragedy. Don't wear Mazda Team Yost stuff unless you're planning on catching on fire. You may have noticed that I've been gone for about a week. That was not voluntary. I was bedridden with some sort of a sickness. I never went to the doctor. I just took some cold pills and bared it. But I'm finally back. But unfortunately, that means I've neglected a lot of the Rolex 24 coverage I was planning on producing for this channel. So to make up for it, I'm going to review the race, go through each of the 4 classes of competition, and then at the end also get to talking a little bit more generally about the race itself and bitching about NBC Sports. That should be exciting, so let's get into it. So let's talk about the GTD class, the most populated of the classes. Something like 23 entries took the green flag, and in a lot of ways this was one of the most competitive classes in the entire race. Now, it really shouldn't be much of a surprise that the teams with the most thinly veiled all-pro driver lineups in what is supposed to be a Pro-Am class were the ones that came to the front, particularly those manufacturers being Lamborghini, Audi, Lexus, and Acura. Those cars, those teams that participated with those cars seemed to be the ones that were running up front throughout the majority of this race. The win eventually went to the Grasser Racing Lamborghini. That team won the race last year with Lamborghini, and at that time becoming the first team to ever win a 24-hour or even a major endurance race for the Lamborghini brand. Well, they've come back and done it again, but really the tale of this race came down to what was the last hour. It was my people, the Land Audi, that was kind of dominating the race towards the end of the race. They were trying to make up for last year when they got completely screwed out of the Rolex 24 last year when IMSA docked them 3 minutes for being smarter, working smarter, not harder with their fuel rigs to fuel faster and thus gain an advantage over the teams that weren't thinking. Unfortunately, IMSA is a no thinking zone, as we'll talk about in the LMP2 class, and they got penalized for it. But it looked like they were really on their way to kind of righting that wrong and being able to take victory. But the torrential rains that came down toward the end of the race caused, I think it was Christopher Mies, to spin down into turn 1. That gave the lead and the eventual win to the Grasser Racing team. I think the surprise for many people, it wasn't for me. I actually thought that the Lexus team, which is run under Aim Vassar-Sullivan, which is a brand new team for this year. It was ran under Rocket Sports, aka 3GT Racing, as to not get sued by Ryan Hunter-Reay. That's a whole nother story. But this was the first year for that team running Lexus, running the Lexus program, and they came right out of the gate and they looked fantastic. They had a lot of the drivers they had last year under the Lexus banner, but they had a few new drivers that really, I think, elevated the program and definitely kept them in contention a lot more than a lot of the other teams. I guess we'll talk about Acura as well. It seemed like the 86 car, the one that Catherine Legg nearly won the championship in last year, was very, very strong with drivers like Justin Marks, AJ Allmendinger, keeping that car near the front. But again, it just kind of seemed like that car kind of faded towards the end of the race, and some of the European teams, I mean, again, the European teams are so good, particularly in GTD, which is known around the world and really everywhere but IMSA as GT3 racing. These teams know how to get it done. They race in Europe mostly in endurance-style races like the VLN over in Germany at the Nordschleife, as well as the Bankplan Endurance Series. I mean, these teams know what they're doing. So when they come over here, I mean, they really wipe the floor with the IMSA competitors most of the time. I mean, that's why we've seen Land, the Monteplas by Land team, run up front when they ran the entire North American Endurance Championship last year. They ran up front at every single race, and the reason for that is because they're just so experienced. So really, GTD in a lot of ways is the most difficult race to win if you're an IMSA competitor, because all these other GT3 teams just seem to be so much more experienced and have such more experienced drivers in this particular formula, in this particular situation. That makes it difficult for teams like Lexus or Acura, even when they are running virtual factory programs, to get up there and compete. And I guess the other car that was kind of up there was the Wins Mercedes. They kind of seemed to fade away, again, particularly when it started raining. Some people were speculating that they definitely played with the BOP, or at least played chicken with IMSA on that one, and actually got some benefits from it. Particularly because their AM driver, Ben Keating, was very, very fast and able to challenge a lot of the factory drivers from the other teams. Hard to tell, again, because of the fact that that car fell out of the race, or just fell out of contention for the race win. Pun. It's kind of hard to tell whether or not those speculations were justified. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the GTE, or I guess GTLM portion of this, but I think really looking at it, I think the future for GT racing in IMSA is going to be in the GT3 formula. I'm starting to look at the GTE category, and I'm starting to see a lot of things start to get long in the tooth, so to speak. I think that category has got a lot of the stink that stuff like GT1 did, or LMP1 did towards the end of their run. So I would like to see a lot of this false pretense be thrown out about GT3 racing, at least in the United States, where they're acting like, you know, there's doctors and lawyers driving the cars. They're clearly not anymore, and I don't think there's a lot of people who have any or nobody's trying to disguise it anymore. It's truly a pro category. They should just make it a pro category, allow factory teams, or maybe don't allow factory teams. I don't know. It depends what happens with GTLM. But yeah, I would like to see all that thrown out. I would like to see it become more of a pure race from the perspective of you bring whoever you bring. If you can hire 4 amazing drivers, you know, that's up to you. That's your advantage, so to speak, for having a higher budget. You can hear the IMSA police behind me for speaking the truth. I guess we'll go on to GTLM. So GTLM was definitely the race that IMSA kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. BOP, in my opinion, completely ruined this race from the perspective of any kind of legitimate competition. So really, Porsche had this race lock, stock, and barrel, and had it not rained, they probably would have won by maybe a full lap over the next best challenger they had, at least when it was dry, the Risi Competizione Ferrari 488. I guess thankfully for people who like GTLM, like that class of racing, the race significantly improved once the downpours started happening around 5 in the morning, because suddenly the Porsches didn't seem to have quite as great of traction or the ability to go well in that particular condition set, and it brought a lot of cars back into the fold, particularly, again, the Ferrari 488. You also had the BMW kind of come out of nowhere and start to challenge for the win, as well as the Fords, which, by the way, the Fords got absolutely wrecked on BOP. I mean, it was complete. I mean, they were completely gone. They qualified at the back of the field and really weren't competitive all the way up until the kind of waning hours of the race, when you've just got to hand it to the drivers and the team, and I guess the car as well, that they were able to claw their way back up. And in fact, at one point, it looked like car number 67, the Castrol throwback Ford GT, was actually going to win the race until it had a spin down in turn 1 where so many other cars did, and it took it out of the race. And by the way, the 66 almost won until it got Porsche'd down into turn 1. One of the Porsches just completely missed turn 1 and was unable to get the car slowed down. Corvette racing was virtually anonymous during this race. They really didn't have very much competitive nature, and again, it came down to mental errors. We see so many mental errors with the Corvette team. They ran into each other again under a pit stop. That took one of their cars out of the race, and then later another of their cars ended up spinning down into turn 1 and crashing out of the race. So really, a bad start to the year for Corvette Racing. And again, you don't see Ford Chip Ganassi Racing making mistakes like the kind that Corvette Racing makes. I mean, if you're a Corvette fan, I'm sorry you have to hear it that bluntly, but that's kind of the way it is. I guess finally, I'll talk about first I'll talk about Risi Competizione. They generally don't run the full season, which I think is a crying shame because they're one of the best teams in IMSA, especially when they have the practice and get it right. They certainly got it right today or yesterday at the Rolex 24, and quite frankly, they probably should have won. Had the race run to completion, they probably would have. Unfortunately, they were unable to get it done, but I thought their performance was definitely the standout of the GTLM division. And I thought as a team they really stepped up. When you consider in some respects they're a factory team, but they're not really. They're really kind of the one privateer entry in the GTLM category, and they were able to compete with all the factories. Finally, we'll talk about BMW because one driver in particular on that team I want to shine a special spotlight on, and that's Alex Zanardi. What a joy it was that Alex Zanardi was back racing in the United States. The first time he's raced in the United States since Road America in kart in 2001. And as someone who grew up with kart, I'm sure a lot of people who watch this channel and have the same fond memories that I do about kart, we're filled with joy to see Alex Zanardi back racing in the United States. I mean, and this is going to sound weird, and I hope it doesn't get misinterpreted, but in a lot of ways, to a fan like me, it's almost like Alex Zanardi's been dead for 15 years. At least the Alex Zanardi I watched, as a kid and idolized and said, oh my God, this guy is just, he's Superman. He cannot be beaten. He cannot be, denied. He's just one of these drivers that's just a generational talent. And in a lot of ways, we haven't seen that guy for a very long time. And, he has had all this success in life, the Paralympics, the DTM, the touring car racing, the 24 Hours of Spa, stuff like that. But when he was, you could just tell he was back. The old Zanardi was back. Seeing him drive that car with hand controls, just absolutely spectacular. I mean, it's some of the best TV throughout the broadcast was just watching how he was able to control the car in such an unconventional way and run just as fast as everybody else. I mean, it was unbelievable. There was a point, and the broadcast never picked up on it, but he came into the bus stop one time and he outbraked 2 prototypes, and it was like, oh my God, this guy, despite the disability, he's just as good as he ever has been, and it's wonderful to watch. It really, really is, and it just brought a huge smile to my face every single time Zanardi was on the screen. I mean, what do we have to do to get him a full-time ride in a racing series somewhere? I mean, I want to see him race every weekend. I want to buy a ticket. I want to go see Zanardi. I mean, because he's such an incredible cult of personality just in general, and then you put him out on the racetrack and he's every bit as good as he was in 1996. I mean, that is, a special kind of guy. If his heart's not in it, obviously, if he doesn't want to continue racing, that's his choice. But if he has any desire, man, somebody's got to give him a contract because it's just so entertaining to watch. And by the way, BMW won the race. Unfortunately, it didn't come from the Zanardi car. Kind of the unfortunate thing that I've been kind of gushing over was that those hand controls unfortunately kind of screwed the car up early on. They had some glitches with the getting the wheel to work with the car, and then eventually the electronics kind of freaked out, so they lost a ton of time with the 24 car. That kind of took them out of contention. But the 25 managed to sneak up there and take the win in the rains, kind of sneaking by the Fords, the Porsches, and the Ferraris that all seemed to kind of be in contention to win late. But it was BMW taking the GTLM win. Again, I'm a little bit worried about the future of this class. We're coming down to the point where Ford is going to probably leave by the end of the year. They're going to go DPi racing. So the class itself, assuming Risi is not a full season entrant, is going to be Porsche, Chevy, and BMW. Chevy's going to have a brand new car. coming next year. I don't think the fans are going to like it. I think the fans are going to revolt against it because it does not sound like the Corvettes of old, and the engine isn't even in the same place as the Corvettes of old. So how long will Porsche stick around in that particular class? Apparently their car is at the very top end of its development cycle, and there's not really a whole lot of speed to gain out of it. How long will they maintain their interest? So, you know, there's a potential that it could come down to just being BMW and Chevrolet in that class, and then you're right back to where you were with top GT racing with GT1 back in the day. Is it a bit of a stretch? Yes, but in some respects, like I mentioned in GTD, I'm kind of getting that feeling that the end is coming for the GTLM division. I could be wrong, but I don't know. History generally doesn't favor classes which start to just kind of get that lethargic feeling to them. So let's talk very briefly about a really bad decision that IMSA made, and that was to split the prototype divisions and begin its own personal LMP2 class. Really, we should have called this Spec Orica Gibson, because there were exactly 4 entries in the race, 2 entries that absolutely are not going to be full-time, Dragon Speed Racing from the European Le Mans Series. Turns out they won the race with a wrecked race car. And the other 2 entries are kind of on shaky ground at best going forward in terms of whether or not they will turn up at the remaining races. There could be as few by the time we get to Sebring as 2 entries at that race. And by the time the series reaches Long Beach, there could be only 1. So that's definitely a conundrum that IMSA is going to have to deal with going forward with the LMP2 division. I mean, it was the Who Cares Bowl. Nobody really cared about it. It was just kind of there. The cars brought out a couple of full course yellows. It's really kind of the more expensive version of Prototype Challenge. And arguably, Prototype Challenge should have ended about 7 years before it ended up actually ending. It kind of goes back to the whole talk about what I was talking about in the GT divisions. Who cares, or why the need for Pro-Am divisions at this particular point? There really isn't. There's no pretense anymore. The true gentleman drivers are racing in the pro categories anyway. You look at John Bennett with the Nissan DPi. So I don't get the point of this class. It's clearly, the market has clearly rejected it in every way. I guess the good thing is that Pastor Maldonado managed to get a win. Excuse me. I'm allergic to Pastor Maldonado, apparently. Yeah, I guess that was the only positive. Outside of that, I don't know. It's amazing that a division can fall that quickly. I mean, imagine last year with LMP2 how diverse and interesting the entries were. Variety of big teams. You had 3 different manufacturers simply from the P2 side of things entered in the prototype division, and you get here this year and there's 4 entries total. They're all Orecas, and they're all pretty boring entries from that perspective. So again, I don't get it. I wish IMSA would have done something a lot different. Maybe try to get each of the P2 teams that we're thinking about coming, maybe get them find a way to get them a Dallara, or get them some sort of a DPi, the Cadillac, or maybe convince Roger to share some of the Acura parts. I don't know. But what they've got right now is a big thumbs down from me. So let's talk about the main enchilada of the Rolex 24, and that was the DPi category. DPi was the best thing about this year's Rolex 24. The category is absolutely fantastic. I think IMSA has done a fantastic job with it. Very exciting racing throughout the race. It was never a runaway, but at the same time, you had the people or drivers and teams able to establish themselves as dominant. You knew who the fast guys were. You knew who the slow guys were. It's one of the best categories in racing right now. So I guess we'll talk with about each of the, I guess, manufacturers, even though there are some manufacturer efforts and some that are privateers. But regardless, Mazda Team Yost, man, they broke the track record. A lot of people were speculating that they would. Obviously, we had data to back that up because they broke it in the Roar before the 24 test. They proved that they had that speed. They did it again in qualifying. They started from the pole, and they kind of dominated the race at the beginning. They certainly battled a lot with Acura Team Penske as well as the top-running Cadillac cars. But unfortunately, as night fell, things got from bad to worse, because within the space of just a couple of minutes, the 55 Mazda had some sort of an electrical issue, and then the number 77, which was the pole-sitting car, caught on fire. So Mazda gonna Mazda, unfortunately. That was just kind of the name of the game for them. The 55 got back out onto the racetrack, but then they had more electrical issues. They got run over in the infield, and that was the end of that for that particular team. Acura Team Penske, they are finally starting to show some reliability, despite the fact that the 6 car, which was the Simon Pagenaud car, unfortunately had some, I think it was a fuel line issue or something that prevented them from finishing the race as high as they could. But the number 7 car ran virtually a flawless race, and really, had the race gone to its conclusion, they probably would have at least contended for the win. I don't know if they would have been able to win. But what's interesting is that the new driver in that car, Alexander Rossi, clearly endeared himself to Team Penske. And I don't want to talk too much IndyCar here, but Roger Penske was very complimentary of Alexander Rossi, and it showed because he gave him the final 4-hour stint in that car to try to win the race. That is very trustworthy of a guy of Roger Penske's caliber and racing knowledge to put their brand new driver in with that kind of responsibility to try to win that particular program's biggest race. Now I guess we'll talk about we'll talk about the wild card first. I think Core Autosport needs a particular shout out. Unfortunately, they kind of fell by the wayside toward the end of the race. They had a lot of struggles in the wet conditions with running into things, unfortunately. But considering that Core Autosport just recently took delivery of those cars from Extreme Speed Motorsport, Rests in Pepperoni, they have done a fantastic and professional job preparing that particular car, and they were running up front, and they looked like they were going to be able to challenge for the win coming towards the end of the race. So big shout out to them. Talk about the Cadillac cars, particularly Action Express and Wayne Taylor Racing. It doesn't really change a whole lot. It's always those two teams running up at the front at the Rolex 24. It seems like the Cadillac is still pound for pound the best car in DPi. It's so reliable. It's bulletproof. It's a car that just will run like the Energizer Bunny. Action Express Racing looked like they had the ticket to beat. Unfortunately, the number 5 car ran into some troubles. Looked like that car may have been the fastest of anybody in the race, but unfortunately they got into the wall a couple of times, and that dropped them significantly down the order. So the onus of trying to win the race fell on the 31, the Whelen Engineering car. Philippe Nasr was the kind of the lion in that car. Unfortunately, once the water really hit big time towards the end of the race, he just went straight off the track and made way for our Lord and Savior, Fernando Alonso. And this is going to be controversial because I know there's going to be a lot of Wayne Taylor fans that'll get mad at me for saying this, but he carried that team on its back, or on his back, so to speak. Fernando Alonso was the absolute star in that car. There's a reason they put him in for like half the race, because he was so much faster than everybody else on that track. I mean, a virtuoso performance from Fernando Alonso. We see this a lot in the endurance racing from him, particularly on the big stages. Le Mans, I remember particularly when he was up against Jose Maria Lopez, who was driving the other Toyota in that race. Alonso just completely destroyed him in that head-to-head contest. And again, we had this kind of happening. He would go up against Pipo Derani, who we know is one of the best drivers in sports car prototype racing. Absolutely destroyed him. Philippe Nasr, you could see Fernando was just able to get in his head, and then away Philippe Nasr went when the water really kind of started coming down. I mean, Fernando Alonso was truly the star of this race, and that's really ultimately why Wayne Taylor Racing was able to take their second Rolex 24 in the DPi era. But, I mean, it was an excellent race start to finish for the DPi cars. And I'm not saying that Kamui Kobayashi is chopped liver, or Renger van de Zande, or Jordan Taylor, but it was just pretty obvious once Alonso was in that car that it just seemed to go a lot better. I mean, at one point he had like a 20-second lead, and considering how close the competition was in DPi start to finish, I mean, that comes down to the driver, folks. I don't know what else you want me to say. So finally, very briefly, I'm going to touch on some just kind of general things. Particularly, we're going to talk real quick about the rain and IMSA's decision to continue in the rain. I think it was absolutely justified. I think it was absolutely perfect. I think they ended the race right when they should have. I think they allowed the drivers to race when at the exact right points. I know Wayne Taylor was being negative Nancy the whole time, talking about how dangerous it was, but ultimately his car was in the lead. So how much of his bitching was political? I think a lot of it. I think that they did a fantastic job to trust the tire manufacturer. Just imagine if Continental had been providing the tires like they were last year, I think they wouldn't have been able to do that. I think Michelin did a fantastic job. I think the drivers did a fantastic job, and I think IMSA did a fantastic job of giving the fans a show and letting the race play itself out naturally. That was very important, and I think it reached its correct and natural conclusion. NBC Sports, their first try at an IMSA broadcast, I would give it probably a 7 out of 10. Here's some constructive criticism for you, NBC. There was too much rut, there was too much Peacock pit box, and there was too much NASCAR-laden content. Let's talk about Rutledge first. Now, I don't have anything personal against Rut. In fact, I think that he is a genuine race fan, and I think he's genuinely excited to be there. I think that's what you see a lot of his personality that rubs people the wrong way. I think that's genuine enthusiasm. What rubs me the wrong way is the fact that a guy like Rut and his, or at least his shtick, is to distract people from the race itself. The entire premise of the Rutledge Wood segments are to say, hey guys, you're at a motor race. How to not watch, or here is how to not watch an automobile race. And unfortunately, that's ultimately where I have the contention with Rutledge. You have racing out on track, and then it's the, hey guys, check this out. And it distracts from the overall race itself. Speaking of distractions, the Peacock pit box. I think it was a segment that was used entirely too much. They clearly missed important moments of the race. It seemed like the best racing on track always seemed to happen during the Peacock pit box segments. And I guess it gets into another point, is that it's too heavily NASCAR focused. You have on the Peacock pit box, which they devoted so much time to, you have Chris Devoda, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Steve Letarte. Nothing against them personally, again, but certainly Chris Devoda, I doubt will watch another IMSA race this year. Therefore, the whole Peacock pit box thing is kind of the meme that I created, 2 or 3 years ago, the bandwagon fans. That's really what they are. Now, there's nothing wrong with the three of them, particularly Earnhardt and Letarte. They clearly were into the race, but the Peacock pit box really needs somebody on top of that thing that understands and knows how to explain sports car racing, not only to the viewers, but perhaps to Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Steve Letarte, to be able to give them a little bit more perspective on what's going on and how to kind of analyze things a whole lot better. The NASCAR focus of the broadcast, unfortunately, kind of dragged it down a little bit. And it's kind of weird, too, because, I'm not saying that there should have been no NASCAR focus or no NASCAR people. But you look at a lot of the... virtually everybody who was an IndyCar guy who was there. You look at Paul Tracy, you look at Kevin Lee, you look at Jan Beekes. They were able to camouflage themselves and just kind of step right in and not be a sore thumb sticking out in an IMSA broadcast. And that being said, a lot of the NASCAR people did a fantastic job. I thought Dave Burns and Kelly Stavist were excellent. They were excellent. They were really, really good. In fact, Kevin Lee was really, really good too. Kind of above average in terms of just a pit reporter in general, not even just talking about going through IMSA and whatnot. They were just above average. I thought Rick Allen was serviceable. Some people were upset by him. I thought he did a fine job. Lee Diffie went right back into his old speed style of doing things and was fantastic. I thought guys like Parker Kligerman were a little bit out of their depth, it seemed. especially judging by how kind of the drivers were reacting to some of the questions that he was asking, which was kind of weird because he got all the big interviews. He got to interview Zanardi and Alonso, and they all just kind of were like the whole time. And it was kind of weird because he wasn't necessarily asking things that were too out there, but I don't know. They sensed something, I could tell, the kind of big drivers. Yeah, it was so weird because I wish there would have been some more sports car people in there. I wish it would have felt a little bit more like an IMSA broadcast instead of kind of like an all-star broadcast. And I know that the Rolex has always kind of had the stigma of being an all-star event, but I don't know. Just imagine, and God almighty, it might actually happen, by the way. Imagine if the NBC Indy 500 broadcast had constant cuts to the Peacock Pit Box where you've got Chris Lavoda and Dale Earnhardt Jr. and Steve Letarte trying to talk about what's happening in the Indy 500 while there's a battle for the lead, you know, between Will Power and Scott Dixon and Alexander Rossi. And they're 3 wide and going into turn 1, and Letarte's saying something, you know, strange, or Dale Jr.'s asking about a 24-hour NASCAR race. Like, that stuff would be super jarring, and who knows? And you know Rutledge, they're going to bring Rutledge to the Indy 500, so what am I even, you know, talking about? So NBC, shape up a little bit, but you did much better than Fox. They clearly put effort into it, which I will give thumbs up to. I think, again, I complain because I care, and I think that NBC has a solid start, despite what I say. So, that was a long-winded review of the Rolex 24. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope my sick brain hasn't been too all over the place, too scatterbrained. I hope I've gotten my points across as best I can. And thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe for more motorsport content that will actually be coming, because I am, despite the coughing, feeling much better than I was about Monday of last week. So we'll see you in the next video.